And welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, we have another instalment of our special series, A Life in Politics, where we shine a spotlight on individuals who've had particularly influential careers in Parliament. This week, I'm speaking to Kwasi Kwarteng, who's seen things from the front and the back benches. He was Business and Energy Secretary, and of course, there was an ill-fated brief spell as Chancellor. But does he have any regrets? Let's find out on Westminster Watch, A Life in Politics with Kwasi Kwarteng. Let's just get more of an overview of Kwasi Kwarteng's eventful career. He was first elected as Conservative MP for Spelthorne in 2010. He served on committees for transport, pensions and public accounts, as well as being a Brexit minister. His first appointment as Secretary of State came in 2021. That was as Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary under Boris Johnson. But he is best known for his stint as Chancellor under Liz Truss in 2022. She would be the UK's shortest-serving Prime Minister, and Kwasi Kwarteng would be in his post only 38 days, brought down by his own ambitious tax-cutting mini-budget.
We were faced with a 70-year high tax burden. We were confronted with low growth, and the path we were on was clearly unsustainable. So that's why we are cutting taxes for working people. That's why we will reverse the national insurance hike on the 6th of November. And that's why we will bring forward the 1p cut to the basic rate of income tax by 1 year. That's why we will take 200,000 people out of paying stamp duty altogether. Taken together, this is what our support will do for all our people.
That didn't go down well. The markets fell into turmoil. The value of the pound plummeted. Mortgage lenders withdrew deals. And 3 weeks later, Kwasi Kwarteng was dismissed as Chancellor. He said he won't stand at the next election, which means after 14 years, all of them spent on the government benches, his time in politics will come to an end on July the 4th. And now he joins us on the Westminster Watch bench. Well, it's a sort of a bench. Welcome to former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. Let's start at the beginning, shall we, Kwasi? What does being an MP really mean to you?
Well, it's a huge privilege, and of course I'm going to say that. And also it's incredibly stretching. So 1 minute, you might be going to a local primary school. The next minute you might be going on a delegation to a country in the Middle East. I visited Egypt a number of times as a backbencher. The next minute you're seeing ministers as a backbencher talking about policy. The next minute you're talking to people in your association, who need to hear from you as a member of Parliament. You might have to do a fundraiser. So it's an incredibly wide-ranging and challenging job.
Do you remember the night you won? Will you ever forget that, what it felt like?
It's an extraordinary privilege. I mean, I remember we were elected actually on the same day in 2010. And you'll remember there was a huge euphoria about the fact that the Conservatives were going back into government in some shape or form. And as new MPs, there was a huge excitement about the fact that of the 308 odd Tory MPs that were elected that day, 147 of them, of us, were new. So there was lots of energy, lots of expectation, lots of engagement with the process.
So beyond that, what would you say your proudest moment is of what you've done in Parliament?
So a lot of what I did in the Energy Department.
You were Secretary of State.
I was Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And I think a lot of the work I did there, I helped bring in the annual auction on wind farms. We did the 10-point plan when I was Minister of State for green energy. There was the COP26 conference, which my friend and former boss, Alok Sharma, was president of. We did a lot of work driving the net zero agenda. And that was something that I found not only engaging, but something that I am proud of.
So you may not have had a long time as Chancellor, and we'll come to that.
Yeah, that's right.
But you were also the first black Chancellor in the country.
Yeah,
Did that mean
huge.
a lot to you?
Yeah, it did. But of course, I'd been the first black Secretary of State. So in a way, a lot of those boundaries, I'd essentially broken through the glass ceiling in many ways. We had Paul Boateng, but he was in cabinet, but he was never Secretary of State. He was never in charge of a department. So remarkably, I was the first black Secretary of State, and that was something which I'm proud of.
Let's turn to the Liz Truss administration. A lot of time has passed since then, of course.
Right.
Do you ever regret backing Liz Truss for leader?
No, I think, it rapidly became a question of Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, and I respect both of them. And I had battles with Rishi in terms of the energy profits levy, which is a tax on the North Sea, as I saw it. And there were good arguments to bring it in. I totally understand, but it was as a policy I was against it.
This was when he was Chancellor.
That was when he was Chancellor, and I felt that Liz's low tax agenda was sat more comfortably with where I was. And I was sort of mid-ranking cabinet minister. I was fairly senior. And of course, you have to make a choice. Now, I think Rishi Sunak is a good prime minister because he's got the right temperament. And I don't think Liz Truss was quite temperamentally, dare I say, suited to the job. I mean, that was revealed.
Did you know that before?
I wasn't sure about it. She's a good friend, someone I knew well. But you could never really know what people are going to react, how people are going to react under immense pressure. I mean, it's a hugely pressurized job. And of course, I was very surprised when she sacked me. It was on Twitter. I mean, I've told this story many times. And I just thought it was a shame. I mean, not only from a personal point of view, but more importantly, I thought the agenda in terms of reducing the tax rate and the tax burden, if you like, was the right policy.
You stood by her. You also stood by her beliefs that institutions like the OBR, the Bank of England, and the Treasury needed shaking up. You did that when you sacked your permanent secretary at the Treasury.
But that was the one thing we did. I mean,
well, you did, but to my point, if I may, that you were robustly behind Liz Truss's agenda and believed in it. Shouldn't she have stood by you rather than sack you?
Well, that was my view. So I said to her in the course of the interview, so what happened was I was in the IMF meeting in Washington. Right. I'd been summoned the day before, which I thought was crazy because I thought that just increased the atmosphere of chaos and panic. And I was clear about that. I said that not only to her, but to her chief of staff. I said, if you call me back before the meetings have been concluded, that will add and increase the sense of chaos and the atmosphere, dare I say, of panic.
But they still pressed their hand.
They still did that. And I was very clear to her, and I've said this a number of times, that if she sacked me, that was it. Her premiership was over. And actually, the one thing I got wrong was that I'd said that it would take 3 weeks. I said, you've got 3 weeks. It was 6 days. So I was sacked, I think, on the 14th of October, 2022. And she resigned, which was a Friday. And then not even within a week. I mean, within a week, she'd resigned on the 20th.
Was she listening to the wrong people, or was she just not listening, which is what many people say is one of her flaws?
I don't know what happened. I think she was under extreme stress. Frankly, I think she panicked. But again, she would say that that we were facing market meltdown on Monday. But it was a case of, yes, you can try and see how far you can extend your career, or you could end it. And as far as I was concerned, once she'd sacked me, that was it. It was over. And just as a coda to that, she was very, very friendly and sad. And she presented me a copy of her. She did a press statement, an interview essentially with the press call. The afternoon I was sacked.
She did.
And I said to her very bluntly that the only question they're going to ask is, if you sacked the person who implemented your program and what you stood on, why are you still here? And that was indeed what they asked. And she didn't really have a convincing answer to that. She was there. I think the press conference lasted about 10 minutes. And at that point, I saw bits of it. Didn't see the whole thing. But at that point, I knew it was over.
Do you still stand by the plans in your mini-budget that were aggressively pointed to growth, but also, as presented, were unfunded tax cuts?
So that was the bit, the unfunded tax cut. And I actually wrote a book about this called War on Gold, published in 2014. And I've always been, and I said to her, I said, I'm not a Reaganite. I think you've got to balance the books. And if you're going to present tax cuts, you've got to show at least some willing on the other side of the ledger. You've got to show some spending restraint. And ideally, the two should be presented together. And I'm not saying penny for penny. So for every tax cut you do, you don't have to match it exactly with spending restraint. But you've got to show some
fiscal
nod.
responsibility
that's right,
or balance.
That's right. I mean, the idea that you're going to... I've never been a very crude Laffer curve person. Although I agree with Art Laffer. I think he's a brilliant man. He's a friend. And I don't think he's...
Just to be clear, that's the idea that there comes a point when
that's right.
you lower taxes, you raise more.
That's right. And I think that's a key principle. But I think you've got to show some sort of spending restraint. And actually all through the summer we discussed...
So why didn't you show it to the OBR? And looking back, was that a mistake not to show your budget to the OBR?
I think so.
Was that your call or Liz Truss's call?
Well, we decided... actually, she'd campaigned against the OBR during her leadership.
Yeah.
She'd said very explicitly. And I think the one thing that we have, because we've got government by PPE students, that's politics, philosophy and economy. I'm a historian. As a historian, you've got to deal with institutions. You understand the cultural and institutional context. And I'm afraid I don't think we did that enough. I don't think we thought we knew what the answer was, and we just sort of delivered it without looking at the institutional context. And I think that was a mistake.
Do you think, actually, having got rid of your permanent secretary, a chap called Tom Scholar, that he might have flagged the impact of not having obvious OBR support? But more importantly, talk about that other issue, the massive sell-off proposed by the Bank of Gilts.
Yes.
The LDIs, as they were called. Would he have picked up what was coming down the line?
I'm not sure he would have done, because
you didn't know, did you?
No, we didn't. And the bank, whether they knew and didn't tell us or didn't know.
This caused much of the market crash
that's right.
that pushed interest rates up. So hang on, if you're not accountable for the not knowing that, taking into account the LDIs, if the Prime Minister didn't know,
she didn't know.
Has anyone taken accountability?
Well, I think it was the bank. I think so. So in my overall, I think everyone had some responsibility for what went wrong. Frankly, it's not true to say it was all the Prime Minister's fault. It's not true to say it was all my fault. But neither is it true or plausible to say it was all the Bank of England's fault. It was a collective. There were collective mistakes.
Do you think that Liz Truss is right that effectively those institutions are running the country and not you, the politicians?
I think I do agree with her that they have huge influence.
Too much?
Probably. I mean, you've got a point where a lot of people in the market say to me, well, it doesn't matter whether Reeves or Hunt is the Chancellor, it's the same trajectory. And you're dealing with the same institutions. My regret was that, having got into the office, I think if we'd been more sensitive to the institutional context, we would have lasted a lot longer.
Did you advise that, or are you looking back now with hindsight?
I'm looking back. I thought intuitively that we were going too fast. But, I probably wasn't vocal enough. But I don't think it would have made any difference. I think the Prime Minister was very, very keen to get going. She wanted everything done instantly. My view was, and we had this conversation, I said, 2 years is quite a long time. She said, I've only got 2 years. And I said, well, actually, 2 years is quite a long time. And I said to her, if you carry on like this, you'll have 2 months. And that's what happened. She drove the machine at a great pace. I think it was one of her special advisors who said she liked to dial the volume up to 11, not 10. I mean, 10. She was very, very dynamic, wanted to blast through things. And I think it's that classic proverb, Aesop's proverb, fables, the tortoise and the hare. And we all know who won the race. It was the tortoise that won the race. It wasn't the hare. And I think if you go very fast, there's a risk that things can go wrong. And I'm afraid, looking back, that's what happened.
Do you think, actually, had you been Prime Minister, you might have done it differently?
I mean, my temperament, you know me, is probably a little bit more cautious, a little bit slower. But I get the fact that she won the leadership. That was my view. It wasn't me. I wasn't the person who won the mandate. She was the one who got 80,000 votes from the members and won the leadership. And that was, ultimately, because I'm a great believer, it's very unfashionable now, but I'm a great believer that leaders should take responsibility. Harry Truman, the buck stops here. Do you remember? The buck stops here. That means
on his desk.
On his desk. On his desk. Ultimately, if you are the leader, you take responsibility, the ultimate responsibility, for what happened. And I think that's I've always believed that.
Let's just talk about you and the future a little bit. Why are you ending your parliamentary career?
Well,
to be clear, you're giving up as Member of Parliament.
That's right. Well, my life circumstances have changed. I've got a gorgeous 2.5 years, I think she is. I know she is. Daughter. And I want a different type of life. I've been a Member of Parliament for 14 years. I think you did 5. I did it for 14 years, have done it for 14 years. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to move on. And you will remember, I think you were part of this, we wrote a book in 2005, the plan. It was sort of coordinated by Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan, who's a great Conservative figure and intellectual, Douglas Carswell. And actually in that book, we argued for term limits, I think 15 years. And I think in the modern world, 14, 15
All right, well,
years is a long time to be a member.
Let's explore that, because you staked your career on low tax cuts. You staked your career on growth, deregulating
Absolutely
for
right.
growth, empowering the individual.
And I still believe all of those things.
And that's the interesting thing, because when you look at the Conservative Party now, it is presiding over, since you were in office, 2 more years of low growth, inflation, highest levels of tax burden since the war. You may be leaving Parliament, but you'll still have a vote. Do you think you could really vote Conservative with that record at the next general election?
Well, I think the alternative is worse.
So that's the reason you might vote Conservative?
Yeah, I think, and lots of people will, because actually at the end of the day, the only 2 people who credibly can be Prime Minister are Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer. And from my beliefs, and I know Rishi well, I think he's a highly intelligent, highly capable person. And he's got the right instincts, even though the circumstances...
He's got no political instincts, though.
Well, I mean, people can argue about that. And of course, when he came in, his team, I think rather foolishly, said, no, the grown-ups are in charge. But of course, the grown-ups have done nothing, really, poll-wise, in terms of our polling.
Never mind the polling, they've actually gone back on some measures.
Some of the things.
We're paying more tax than ever before.
That's right.
That's not the grown-ups being in charge
and the
necessarily.
grown-ups, I mean, what I'm find particularly vexatious is the fact that on the VAT rebate for people coming into the country, they're still paying more.
Tax-free shopping.
That's right. And it's to me, that's insane. But that's what they've done. But broadly, I think Rishi Sunak will be a much better Prime Minister for this country.
But haven't we got a
Sir Keir
choice
Starmer.
between basically 2 managers, not 2 leaders, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak?
So I think that, I mean, you can talk about their personalities, but I think that critically, Rishi Sunak understands what makes an economy tick and has got the right instincts on a lot. Even though I've disagreed with a lot of the things he's done, broadly, he's in a better place than Keir Starmer. I mean, what Labour are doing, you look at things like VAT on private schools. I mean, that's insane. It doesn't make any sense, even from a fiscal point of view, because you're driving away. The latest poll I saw, the latest figures, is that 26% of people, of parents whose children are in private schools, are going to move to the state sector. So it creates an even greater burden on provision of state education.
You say that, but obviously there is a huge poll lead at the moment.
That's right.
For they're winning by-elections, the Labour
That's
Party,
right.
consistently and impressively. Let me ask you this. Can Rishi Sunak win the next election?
I think it's very difficult. I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy thing. He's got a real mountain to climb. But you and I will remember the 2017 general election. And I'd spent Easter in Spain. I flew back, I think it was on the 18th of April, that election was called.
This is the Theresa May
2017,
election. Yeah.
Theresa May. And we were 20 points ahead. Roughly where Labour are now, as against us. They're 20 points ahead. Then we were 20 points ahead. When that was on April the 18th. The election was about 6 weeks later, 7 weeks, June the 8th, something like that. And at the election, we were only 2 points ahead. And I remember John McDonnell saying, if the campaign had lasted a week longer, Labour would probably have got in, because during the course of that campaign, the Labour Party literally was about 2 points away.
Okay, so
things can change, that's my point.
Your point's well made, but the reality is there's a lot of people out there who voted Conservative in the past who, if you ask them what the Conservatives stood for, they wouldn't know at the moment. Isn't the next battle for the Conservatives, the reality is, they're going to have to define what conservatism is. What is your brand of conservatism?
So I'm absolutely a low-tax person. I think we need a strong defence, but we need lower taxes, and we need to be able to have the courage to reduce spending where we think it's wasteful and where we think we can create greater efficiencies. And I think in this whole debate, and that's one of the problems people had, with the mini budget, was that we just presented one side of the ledger, the tax cuts, and essentially it was a kind of argument which says tax cuts will pay for themselves through growth. Now I believe that, but you've got to convince the market that you're serious about spending restraint.
But do you think, though, that the country has moved away from conservative values? They want more spending. The public seem to expect the government to sort out just about every problem that comes across them. Aren't you going to be fighting a lonely battle if you fight on those core conservative values in the future?
Well, that's the argument. And I think there's strength in that argument because, of course, we've had COVID. And COVID saw a huge expansion, a huge increase in government expenditure. And there was also an expectation built in that the government essentially has limitless resources and can sign checks to support...
Which they proved they can do.
Which they proved they could do. And so once we did that, the public, rightly or wrongly, said, well, if you've paid billions to support businesses, to support jobs, why can't you spend even more billions on public services? But of course, if you're not getting the revenue in and you're spending more and more money, all you're going to end up with is higher taxes and more borrowing, which leads to higher taxes.
One of the arguments trotted out by the Conservatives regularly when Labour point out that, for example, at the end of this Parliament, people will not be better off than when we went into the Parliament. They point, not unreasonably, to war in Ukraine, and they point to COVID. Looking back, and you were business secretary.
I was, for half of that period.
Do you think that actually furlough, for example, carried on too long and has changed behaviours and expectations from government by having everyone at home getting paid?
So all I would say about that is that if, God forbid, another pandemic struck, I don't think we would be as generous in terms of, or as lavish.
Is that hindsight, or did you think that at the time?
At the time, I thought that, hang on, this is going to be expensive. But of course, we've had hindsight, and I've held other offices since then. I mean, when COVID hit, I was a junior minister in the business department, business and energy, and industrial strategy department. And it was clear to me that, yes, we did need to provide some support, but the extent of that support was something which, was very challenging.
Are you relieved, a little part of you relieved, that you are leaving the fray and won't be standing at the next election?
Well, you know what it's like being an MP. And
I know what it's like to be forced out.
No, that's true.
You're choosing to stand down.
So the difference between you and me and a lot of other colleagues is that, we've been there since 2010. I think people are very tired. They've been in government, either as backbenchers or frontbenchers. We've lived through a whole, host of different crises, different extreme moments of tension, of argument. We've had Brexit. We had the Scottish independence referendum before that. We've had 3 or 4 general elections in a very short period of time. We've had COVID. We've had wars, a war in Ukraine. We've got this.
Quite a lot's happened.
A hell of a lot's happened, particularly in the period after 2015. And I think people are quite tired, and people have decided.
Does that include you?
Yeah, I'm probably, my energy levels are a bit lower than they were when I started in 2010.
So let me ask you, would a new challenge? What's next for Kwasi Kwarteng?
I want to
Will
do
that get
more
the
things.
energy back?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and also there are new challenges. I've always had different challenges in life.
So what next for you?
Well, I'm very interested in doing more in the energy space. I'm very interested in investment, things like private equity and fund management. And I'm also very interested in geopolitical risk and that area. But I think the nature of the modern world, and you know this better than anyone, I mean, you're a broadcaster now, you were an MP, you were a businessman before that. And the nature of the modern world is that we have to adapt. And the idea that you're going to do the same thing for 40 years is not something which, in 2024, is particularly common or realistic.
Well, whatever you choose to do, Kwasi Kwarteng, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Member of Parliament for Spelthorne, thank you very much indeed for joining me here on Westminster Watch. Thanks again to Kwasi for joining me, and don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.